You wake up before the sun, you train fasted before work, you keep the food tight all day, and the fat around your middle refuses to move while everything else on your body slowly shrinks. That exact combination, early hard training on an empty stomach, an aggressive calorie cut, and a short night of sleep, is silently instructing your body to protect the one fat deposit you are trying hardest to remove. Not because effort does not matter, because a hormone that peaks in the first 45 minutes after your eyes open is arriving at the same moment you decide to push, and it is carrying a message your belly fat is built to obey. Here is what is happening in your body right now, whether or not you feel a thing. Cortisol rises between 50 and 160% above its overnight baseline in the first 30 to 45 minutes of every morning. That is normal. That is supposed to happen. The problem is what your visceral fat, the deep fat packed around your organs, does with that signal compared to the fat under your skin. They are not the same tissue. They do not answer to the same hormone at the same volume. And roughly 4 in 10 American adults are carrying enough of the deep kind to change how this entire system behaves, according to national body composition data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Almost nobody in the mainstream explains this part, because the conversation about belly fat stopped at calories about 30 years ago and never restarted. I'm going to walk you through a full 24-hour cortisol cycle, hour by hour, and show you exactly where your current routine is amplifying the signal instead of quieting it. At the end, I will hand you the CAP protocol, 3 specific adjustments, each with an exact number in minutes or grams, that change the hormonal environment your visceral fat lives in. Not a challenge, not a mindset, not a supplement. This is not motivation, it is biology. I read the studies. I will show you what they actually say and who published them, so you can check every claim yourself. The invisible villain in this video is cortisol, but not cortisol the way stress articles describe it. And if you have already heard that stress makes you fat, forget that sentence, because it is so vague it is useless. Here is the exact mechanism nobody puts on a thumbnail. Your visceral fat does not just receive cortisol from your bloodstream. It manufactures its own. Inside those fat cells sits an enzyme called 11-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1. I will call it the amplifier enzyme for the rest of this video. Its job is to take the inactive form of cortisol circulating in your blood, a molecule called cortisone that is doing nothing at all, and switch it back on locally, inside the tissue. Jonathan Seckel and Brian Walker at the University of Edinburgh spent years mapping this, with findings published in The Lancet and in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. What they documented is that visceral fat tissue in people carrying more of it shows higher activity of that amplifier enzyme than lean tissue does. Think of your bloodstream as a delivery network and cortisol as the dispatcher. In most of your body, the dispatcher's orders arrive at whatever volume the blood delivers them. Inside visceral fat, there is a small print shop in the back of the warehouse that takes every order it receives and prints extra copies. The blood test at your annual physical reads the orders leaving the dispatch office. It does not read the copies being printed inside the warehouse. This is why a person can have a completely normal serum cortisol level on paper and still have a fat depot operating in a chronically high cortisol environment. The measurement most doctors use was never designed to see what happens inside the tissue. Now, why does the deep fat care so much about that signal? Because of where it sits and what it is wired to do. Visceral fat carries a much higher density of glucocorticoid receptors, the docking stations cortisol binds to, than the subcutaneous fat under your skin. More docking stations means the same amount of hormone produces a much larger response in that tissue. When cortisol binds to those receptors, one of the first things it does is increase the activity of an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, which is the forklift crew that pulls circulating fat out of the blood and loads it into storage. Cortisol tells the forklift crew in the deep warehouse to work faster. It does not send that same instruction with the same force to the warehouse under your skin. Your body is not being random. It is preferentially stocking the storage unit closest to the loading dock because visceral fat drains directly into the portal vein, the blood vessel that feeds the liver. In a genuine survival emergency, which is what cortisol was designed to announce, energy stored right next to the liver can be converted to blood sugar fastest. So the picture is this: cortisol is not making you fat in some general way. Cortisol is redistributing fat toward your abdomen and defending it there, and the tissue itself amplifies the signal it is receiving. Elissa Epel at the University of California, San Francisco, published work in psychosomatic medicine showing that women with more central fat secreted more cortisol in response to a laboratory stress test and habituated to repeated stress more poorly than women who carried their weight elsewhere. Sarah Jackson at University College London published a study in the journal Obesity Measuring Cortisol in Hair Samples, which captures months of exposure instead of a single morning blood draw, and found that people with higher long-term cortisol had larger waist circumference and were more likely to stay in a higher weight category over time. This is the real biology. It has been sitting in peer-reviewed journals for 2 decades, while the public conversation stayed on calories in and calories out. Let me start the clock now, because the timing of your day is where you either feed this system or starve it. Hour 0 is the moment your eyes open, not the moment you get out of bed, not the moment your feet hit the floor. Conscious arousal is the trigger. Your adrenal glands begin releasing cortisol immediately, and over the next 30 to 45 minutes, that release climbs to the highest single point it will reach in the entire 24-hour cycle. Researchers in psychoneuroendocrinology have measured this so many times across so many populations that it has a formal name, the cortisol awakening response, and it is one of the most predictable events in human physiology. That rise has a purpose. It tells your liver to start manufacturing glucose out of stored material, mostly amino acids and the glycerol backbone of fat, so you have blood sugar available before you eat anything. It raises blood pressure slightly. It sharpens attention. Your body is preparing you to move. In the environment this system evolved in, moving was exactly what happened next. Here is the first collision, hour 0.5. This is the window where most people who are serious about fat loss do their hardest work of the day. Fasted cardio at 5:30 in the morning, a heavy lifting session at 6, a high-intensity interval class before the office. The logic feels airtight. No food in the system, so the body burns fat. And moderate movement in this window does help, which I will come back to. But intense training is itself a cortisol event. Your body does not have a separate hormone for exercise stress and life stress. It uses the same one. When you stack a hard training session directly on top of the highest natural cortisol peak of your day, you are not adding 2 things together. You are multiplying a signal that is already at its ceiling. For people over 50, this matters more, not less. Aging research from multiple groups measuring cortisol across the full day has documented a flatter daily cortisol curve after midlife, with higher evening and overnight levels than the same person produced at 30. The peak is compressed and the floor rises. That means less recovery time at the bottom of the curve and less room to absorb an extra spike without consequences. The same 6 a.m. session that felt productive at 35 is arriving into a different hormonal landscape at 55. Hour 1. The training session is over. You feel excellent, and you should, because the same cortisol and adrenaline surge that just complicated your fat storage picture also produces alertness, mild euphoria, and blunted appetite. This is the trap. The subjective feeling and the biological consequence point in opposite directions. Nothing about this is perceptible. There is no symptom. Your cortisol does not begin its normal downward arc toward the afternoon because you gave it a second reason to stay up. And now you skip breakfast, keep working, and let the hormone run. What happens between hour 1 and hour 6 is where the visceral fat decision actually gets made, and it involves a second hormone that most fat loss content treats as unrelated. That is where I am going next. Hour 1 to hour 3. Your training session ended. Cortisol is still elevated, and your liver is doing exactly what it was told to do, manufacturing glucose out of stored material and releasing it into your blood. This process has a name, gluconeogenesis, and it runs whether or not you have eaten. Blood sugar rises, and when blood sugar rises, your pancreas releases insulin to handle it. Here is the combination almost nobody in the mainstream explains, and it is the center of this entire video. Cortisol on its own is not primarily a storage hormone. On its own, it breaks tissue down and releases fuel. Insulin on its own is a storage hormone, but a fairly ordinary one that fills whichever tank has room. The problem is what those two do when they are elevated at the same time in the same person. Cortisol increases the number of forklift crews in your visceral fat, the lipoprotein lipase I described earlier, and insulin gives them the instruction to start loading. Cortisol builds the capacity. Insulin authorizes the shipment. Neither one alone produces the pattern you see in the mirror. Together, they produce it with remarkable efficiency, and they produce it in the deep abdominal depot specifically, because that is where the receptor density is highest and where the amplifier enzyme is printing extra copies of every order. This is the exact mechanism behind something you have probably observed and never had explained. Two people eat the same amount of food and do the same amount of exercise. One accumulates weight fairly evenly. The other accumulates it almost entirely around the waist, keeps a relatively normal weight on the scale, and gets told by a doctor that the numbers look fine. The difference is not willpower, and it is not metabolism in the vague sense that word usually carries. It is the hormonal environment those calories arrive into. Hour 4 to hour 6. This is mid-morning, and this is where the fasted training decision starts collecting interest. You trained hard, you have eaten nothing, your blood sugar has been propped up by your own liver, and now cortisol is still running above where it should be at this hour. Cortisol raises the appetite signal directly. It increases the drive for calorie-dense, high-sugar, high-fat food specifically, which has been demonstrated repeatedly in controlled feeding research. So the 10:30 in the morning craving that arrives is not a character flaw, and it is not hunger in the ordinary sense. It is a hormonal instruction that was issued at 5:30 when you decided to train. And when you satisfy that craving with something fast, and most people do, because a signal that's strong is very hard to argue with, you deliver a large insulin release into a body that still has elevated cortisol circulating. Capacity, then authorization. The shipment goes to the deep warehouse. Now let me talk about the part of this that makes me genuinely irritated, because I think you deserve to know it was available and was not given to you. The mainstream had two responses to this, and neither one helped anyone. The first came from medicine. If you walked into a doctor's office and said your belly fat would not move and you suspected cortisol, you got a morning serum cortisol test, or possibly a 24-hour urine collection. Those tests were designed to answer one question. Do you have Cushing's syndrome, a rare disorder where cortisol is catastrophically elevated, affecting somewhere around 10 to 15 people per million per year? If you do not have Cushing's, the test comes back normal, and you are told cortisol is not your issue. But that test reads the hormone leaving the dispatch office. It cannot read the amplifier enzyme working inside your fat tissue. A completely normal morning cortisol level tells you almost nothing about the environment your visceral fat is living in. The tool answers a different question than the one you asked, and nobody explains that distinction. So you leave believing the mechanism was ruled out when it was never measured. The second response came from the wellness industry, and it went in the opposite direction: adrenal fatigue. The idea that your adrenal glands get exhausted and stop producing cortisol, sold alongside a supplement stack. The Endocrine Society has stated plainly that adrenal fatigue is not a recognized medical condition, and a systematic review published in BMC Endocrine Disorders examined dozens of studies and found no consistent evidence supporting it. So one side gave you a test that could not see the problem, and the other side gave you a fake diagnosis with a product attached. Between those two, the actual mechanism, tissue-level cortisol amplification, receptor density, and the timing collision with insulin, never reached the person it would have helped most. Then there is the fitness industry, and this one is not malice. It is a training model that was built for a different body. The standard prescription when fat loss stalls is more work and less food. Add a session, cut 200 more calories. That prescription was developed watching young athletes respond. And in a 25-year-old with a flexible cortisol curve and 8 hours of sleep, it often works. Applied to a 55-year-old with a flattened cortisol rhythm, 6 hours of sleep, a demanding job, an existing visceral fat that is amplifying every hormonal signal it receives, that same prescription pushes the system further in the wrong direction. We have proof of this, and it is one of the most useful studies in the field. Janet Tomiyama and colleagues at the University of California, Los Angeles, published research in psychosomatic medicine that put people on a calorie-restricted diet and measured their cortisol. Restriction raised cortisol. The intervention that was supposed to reduce fat produced more of the hormone that defends abdominal fat. That does not mean eating less never works. It means the size and duration of the deficit is a hormonal decision, not just a math problem. And past a certain point, you are paying for every calorie you cut with a cortisol increase that partially cancels it. I want to be brief about this next part because I am not here to tell you my story. 3 years ago, I was doing everything in this video wrong while believing I was doing everything right. 5 in the morning alarm, 45 minutes of hard intervals fasted, a deficit I would now describe as aggressive, and about 6 hours of sleep because that is what fitting all of it in required. Over 4 months, the scale dropped 14 pounds. I was satisfied. Then I paid for a body composition scan, the kind that separates the fat under your skin from the fat around your organs. And the deep abdominal number had barely moved. I had lost lean tissue and subcutaneous fat, and kept the one deposit that carries the metabolic risk. That scan is what sent me into the endocrinology literature instead of the fitness literature. I am not offering my experience as evidence. I am telling you why I stopped trusting the scale as a measurement of what I was actually changing. Back to the clock, because the second half of the day is where most people lose the ground they were trying to gain. Hour 10 to hour 14, early afternoon. In a healthy pattern, cortisol has been falling steadily since its morning peak and should now be at roughly a third of where it started. This is your body's daily low-stress window, and physiologically, it is the best time in the day to train hard. Core body temperature peaks in the late afternoon. Muscle strength and power output measurably peak in that same window across multiple performance studies. Growth hormone response to resistance work is intact. You are stronger, better coordinated, and less likely to injure yourself. And the cortisol you generate from the session lands on a descending curve instead of stacking on an ascending one. Almost nobody schedules training here because the culture decided decades ago that discipline means 5 in the morning, hour 16 to hour 20. Evening. This is where cortisol should be approaching its daily floor, and it is also where the modern day loads it back up. Late intense work, screens, a difficult conversation, and alcohol. Alcohol matters more than most people believe here. It raises cortisol directly for several hours, and research from multiple sleep laboratories has documented that it fragments the second half of the night, suppressing the deep sleep stages where growth hormone is released. Growth hormone is the hormone that opposes cortisol's effect on your muscle tissue. Lose the deep sleep, lose the opposition. Hour 22 to hour 30. Overnight. This is where the whole thing either resets or compounds, and I want to give you the number that changed how I think about sleep entirely. Eve Van Cauter and her group at the University of Chicago published a landmark study in The Lancet showing that restricting healthy young men to 4 hours of sleep for 6 nights raised their evening cortisol and dropped their glucose tolerance to a range they described as resembling early-stage diabetes. 6 nights. In young, healthy people. Then, in a study published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, Nedelchiver and colleagues took people on an identical calorie deficit and gave one group 8.5 hours of sleep and the other group 5.5. Same food. Same deficit. Both groups lost the same total weight, but the short sleep group lost 55% less fat and significantly more lean tissue than the long sleep group. The scale reported success in both. The body composition told a completely different story. For people over 50, this is not a small footnote. Deep sleep declines with age on its own. Overnight cortisol tends to sit higher, and the recovery window that used to absorb a bad night now absorbs less of it. Cutting sleep to make room for a workout is a trade that has stopped paying long before most people notice the terms changed. So the 24-hour picture is complete. A morning spike you amplified, an insulin release that arrived while cortisol was still high, an afternoon window you never used, an evening that reloaded the system, and a night too short to clear it. Every one of those is a timing decision, and every one of them is adjustable without eating less than you already do. Which brings me to the 3 adjustments, and to the one mistake that cancels all 3. The KP protocol has 3 components. Each one has an exact number, and each one changes a timing decision rather than asking you to eat less than you already do. Before I go through them, one line that is not optional. If you take medication for blood pressure, blood sugar, thyroid, or if you take any form of corticosteroid, the timing of what follows interacts with those drugs and belongs in a conversation with the physician who prescribed them. That is the flaw, not a formality. The C stands for cap the morning window. No high-intensity training in the first 90 minutes after your eyes open. Not from when you get out of bed, from the moment of conscious arousal, because that is when the cortisol awakening response begins. 90 minutes is the practical minimum, and for people over 50 or anyone running on short sleep, 120 minutes is the better number, because the awakening peak is compressed into a narrower and sharper window as you age. What you do instead of the hard session matters. Movement in that window is helpful. Intensity is what stacks. The specific instruction is to keep anything you do in the first 90 minutes at or below 60 to 70% of your maximum heart rate, which for most people is a brisk walk where you can still hold a full conversation, and to keep it under 45 minutes. That intensity range mobilizes fatty acids for fuel without producing a meaningful adrenaline and cortisol response of its own. It uses the elevated free fatty acids the morning cortisol arc has already released, rather than demanding a larger release. Your hard training moves to the afternoon, ideally between 2 and 6 in the afternoon. This is not a preference. It is where your physiology performs best. Core body temperature reaches its daily maximum in the late afternoon, and studies measuring muscle strength, power output, and anaerobic capacity across the day consistently find peak performance in that window rather than in the early morning. Reaction time is faster. Joint stiffness is lower. Injury rates in early morning training run higher across several occupational and sports datasets. And the cortisol you generate from a hard session at 4 in the afternoon lands on a curve that is already descending, so the hormone clears well before the overnight window, instead of stacking onto a peak that was already at its ceiling. If your schedule genuinely does not allow afternoon training, and for many people it does not, the fallback is straightforward. Keep the morning session, but delay it past the 90-minute mark and cut the intensity portion roughly in half, moving the difference to 2 afternoon sessions a week. A partial move captures a meaningful share of the effect. This is not all or nothing. The A stands for anchor the deficit and the protein. 2 numbers here, and they work together. The first number is 30 to 40 grams of protein in your first meal of the day, whenever that meal falls in your eating window. Not 15, not a splash of protein powder in coffee. 30 to 40 grams of complete protein, because the amount required to trigger muscle protein synthesis rises measurably with age, a phenomenon researchers call anabolic resistance, documented in work from Doug Padden-Jones at the University of Texas Medical Branch and from the Muscle Metabolism Group at the University of Nottingham. A 25-year-old gets a full muscle-building signal from around 20 grams. A 60-year-old often needs closer to 40 grams to produce the same response. This matters directly for the cortisol problem, because one of cortisol's primary jobs is breaking down muscle protein into amino acids for the liver to convert into glucose. Protein at the first meal is the counter signal. It tells the system that raw materials are arriving from outside, so it does not need to take them from your own tissue. The second number is the ceiling on your calorie deficit, no more than 20% below your maintenance level, held there rather than pushed lower when progress feels slow. Past roughly that point, the Tomiyama research I mentioned earlier and the broader literature on restriction and stress hormones show cortisol climbing in a way that works directly against the tissue you are trying to reduce. A moderate deficit held for 12 weeks outperforms an aggressive deficit held for 3 weeks and abandoned, and it outperforms it specifically in the deep abdominal compartment because that depot responds to the hormonal environment more than to the arithmetic. The P stands for protect the 90 minutes before sleep. This is the component people skip, and it is arguably the one carrying the most weight given the Nedelcheva data I walked through, where the same deficit produced 55% less fat loss in the short sleep group. 3 specifics. Dim your light environment 90 minutes before you intend to be asleep, which means overhead lights off and lamps or lower level lighting on, because bright evening light suppresses melatonin release, and melatonin onset is one of the signals that permits cortisol to reach its overnight floor. No alcohol within 3 hours of bed, because it raises cortisol for several hours and fragments the second half of the night, which is where deep sleep and growth hormone release concentrate. And a target of 7 to 8 hours in bed, not 7 to 8 hours of intended sleep, since actual sleep time runs consistently below time in bed for nearly everyone, and the gap widens after 50. That is CAP. Cap the morning window at 90 minutes and 60 to 70% of maximum heart rate. Anchor the first meal at 30 to 40 grams of protein with a deficit no deeper than 20%. Protect the final 90 minutes before sleep with dim light. No alcohol inside 3 hours and 7 to 8 hours in bed. Now the mistake that invalidates all 3, and this is the part I want you to hold on to, because it is where nearly everyone who understands this material still fails. The mistake is measuring the result with a bathroom scale and reacting to a flat number by cutting food further. Here is why that specific sequence destroys the protocol. Visceral fat does not respond on the timeline the scale responds on. When you move training out of the cortisol peak, raise protein, and repair your sleep, the first thing that happens is that you stop losing lean tissue. You may also retain water for the first week or 2 as training volume redistributes and glycogen storage normalizes. So the scale sits still, or it goes up a pound, at exactly the moment the underlying composition is improving. Someone who has been trained by 20 years of weight-focused advice reads that flat number as failure and does the one thing guaranteed to reverse the improvement. Cuts the deficit deeper, adds a session back into the morning, and pushes the cortisol curve right back where it was. 2 weeks of correct biology, undone by the wrong instrument. The instrument you want instead costs about $6, a tape measure. Waist circumference at the level of your navel, taken first thing in the morning before eating, standing relaxed rather than sucking in, on the same day each week. Waist circumference is the strongest widely available proxy for visceral fat, and it is the measurement large cardiovascular studies use when they want to know abdominal risk rather than body size. Expect the tape to move before the scale does. Expect the meaningful change to appear somewhere between week 8 and week 12, not week 2, because you are altering a hormonal environment and then waiting for the tissue to respond to the new environment. That timeline is not a disappointment. It is what the actual mechanism looks like from the outside. The reason I keep returning to people over 50 is that every variable in this video compounds in the same direction after midlife. The cortisol curve flattens, so recovery windows shrink. Deep sleep declines, so overnight clearance weakens. Anabolic resistance rises, so the same protein does less. And sex hormone changes in both men and women shift fat storage toward the abdomen independently of everything else. None of that is a reason for pessimism. It is the precise reason that timing beats intensity after 50. A 28-year-old can do everything in this video wrong and still get results, which is exactly why the advice built by and for that population keeps failing the people watching this. You do not have their margin for error. You have something better, which is knowing the exact mechanism they never had to learn. This is not motivation, it is biology. Nothing in the CAP protocol asks for more discipline than you are already applying. It asks for the same effort placed at a different hour of the day. If you are going to run the CAP protocol starting this week, comment the word CAP below so I can see who is actually moving on this rather than just watching. I read every comment and I will be watching for the ones who report their waist measurement at week 1 and week 8, because that is the data I want. The next layer of this problem is the one I deliberately left out of this video, and it is the layer that determines how much of this applies to you specifically. Cortisol does not act alone on abdominal fat. It acts alongside falling testosterone in men and the estrogen shift through and after menopause in women, and those hormones change where your body is willing to store fat in the first place. The same cortisol signal produces a very different result depending on that background. That is the next video. And it is where the story of the deep abdominal depot after 50 actually finishes. Subscribe so you get it. It genuinely helps the channel reach the people who need this mechanism explained, and it is the only thing I will ask you for. One video a week, mechanisms rather than motivation, every claim with a name and a journal attached to it.